The Israeli government recently announced that it will be suing the New York Times for defamation after a recent opinion piece published by Nicholas Kristof detailing Israeli sexual abuse in their prisons and detention facilities. The Israeli Foreign Ministry, in their statement surrounding this news, called the piece one of the most hideous and distorted lies ever published against the state of Israel in the modern press. I want you to keep that statement in mind and also prepare yourself as I read the testimony of a Palestinian prisoner who faced sexual violence inside of an Israeli colonial dungeon. This testimony comes from Amir, a 35-year-old Palestinian man who was in Israeli custody. He said, "I was detained in State Amman. They took a group of detainees and me to a corridor between the sections and forced us to strip completely naked. The soldiers brought in several dogs. One of them urinated on me. One of the dogs then raped me in a trained manner while I was being beaten. This continued for several minutes. I felt profoundly humiliated and violated." Now that we've established what this video is going to be about, let's talk about Israeli sexual violence in Israeli prisons and detention facilities. The reporting and testimony that you're going to see comes from Euromed Human Rights Monitor in a recent report titled "Another Genocide Behind Walls." The report details numerous instances of Israeli sexual violence from October 2023 to October 2025, and the picture it paints is horrific. The report noted that since October 7, 2023, the arrest and detention practices of Israeli forces against Palestinians in Gaza have included a widespread system of torture, including consistent patterns of systematic sexual violence. Before we dig into them, it's critical to note that these practices were not isolated incidents or acts in an individual capacity. In fact, an independent UN commission found that specific forms of sexual and gender-based violence, including forced public nudity, sexual harassments, threats of rape, and sexual assaults, were being systematically practiced, effectively becoming part of the work policies and standard operating procedures. It's really critical that you understand that before we go into the findings and the testimony. This isn't just a couple of individual actions being done by a couple of bad apples. This is a systemic practice, their standard operational procedure. And as the report points out, this approach fits into a wider military strategy aimed at subjugating, destroying, and displacing Palestinian society. Now, it's really critical before we dig into all of this that you understand that rape in the context of war, of colonization, of genocide goes beyond just an individual horrific act. Rather, it's a deliberately employed political and military instrument that is used to achieve broader collective objectives. It doesn't just happen against one person in some isolated event. It is employed systematically to humiliate and dismantle collective identity, and in many instances amounts to reproductive violence. Unsurprisingly then, rape and sexual assault are some of the most horrific forms of violence that Palestinian detainees face from within the confines of Israeli colonial institutions. As Euromed Human Rights Monitor points out, documented testimonies reveal these violations involved rape, including cases of serial rape under the threat of death affecting both women and men. In certain instances, soldiers also took turns sexually assaulting the same victim. This obviously took place with the soldiers themselves, as well as with objects, metal rods, wooden sticks, bottles, and even fire extinguisher nozzles. And in what is, I think, one of the most egregious examples of this sorts of violence, testimonies documented the use of trained military dogs to commit sexual assaults against detainees. I'm giving mostly descriptions in this section because the testimonies are so horrific that I genuinely don't think I can actually put them in a video about this information. Needless to say, detainees are regularly experiencing horrific sexual violence in both the hands of their male and female Israeli captors. The violence they're facing is unspeakable and systematic, but it's not just the violence itself, it's the threat of the violence as well. I say that because there's a psychological element to this that extends well beyond the actions, but also includes the threat of the actions themselves. According to these testimonies, those threats are incredibly common and systematic, with Israeli captors regularly telling Palestinians that they will do these things to them if they do not get what they want. And Palestinian detainees are being constantly reminded of this violence, not just through the threats and the violence itself, but by having to witness the violence as well. That's because in many of these instances, Israeli captors are committing this violence publicly in front of other Palestinian detainees. That sexual violence, of course, being accompanied by the sort of standard torture operations that we would come to expect in these sorts of situations. One Palestinian detainee in particular stated that she was moved into an interrogation room, suspended by her hands, and subjected to repeated electric shocks until she lost consciousness. As she experienced that, her Israeli captors showed her videos and photos of the previous times they had sexually assaulted her. And then after all of that, they threatened her with the publication of those materials if she did not cooperate with them. Now, on top of this, we also have to talk about forced nudity. As the report points out, the Israeli army has systematically used forced nudity during arrests and detention. In fact, testimonies indicate that it serves as a constant tool for sexual and psychological torture, aiming to destroy dignity, instill fear, and create a sense of complete helplessness and total submission among Palestinian detainees. This forced nudity affected men, women, and children, and as the report notes, for women, the stripping took on even harsher forms, such as forcibly removing headscarves and conducting strip searches at gunpoint, sometimes in front of their children or male soldiers. One Palestinian, a 40 43-year-old named Redwan later told Euromed Human Rights Monitor this. On 11th December 2023, Israeli vehicles surrounded the house we were in, and the army addressed us through the loudspeakers, ordering us to come down and gather at Kamal Adwan Hospital. We came down and surrendered, and the soldiers handcuffed us and ordered us to strip naked to go to a nearby plot of land. They then took me to a house adjacent to the plot where I was interrogated and suspended by the arms while kneeling. I remember that my triceps were torn due to the severity of the suspension. The same thing happened to my son and the other members of my family who were detained with me under the same conditions. Adding to these horrors, there have also been numerous reported instances of assault on the genitals of Palestinian detainees. Euromed's report details that the documented testimonies obtained by Euromed Monitor indicate that the targeting of detainees' genitals formed a part of a systematic policy of sexual violence and torture aimed at deliberate humiliation, the infliction of permanent physical and psychological harm, and the impairment of reproductive capacity. That violence includes punching, kicking, the use of foreign objects, and squeezing with excessive pressure. As Euromed points out in the report, these practices have led to more than just discomfort, but rather catastrophic medical consequences in many of their documented cases. This is another section where I actually can't read the testimonies because of how graphic the testimonies themselves are, but I would encourage you to read through them. And as you might imagine, alongside all of that, there's also constant verbal and physical harassment of detainees by their Israeli captors. As Human Rights Monitor reports, verbal abuse extends beyond general insults and functions as a tool of sustained sexual humiliation, marked by the repeated use of obscene and degrading language that dehumanizes victims, attacks their family honor, and targets their mothers and sisters with sexually explicit remarks. The testimony of 24-year-old Hadil gives us a look at what this kind of harassment looks like. She said, "One of the occupation soldiers stood behind me. He struck my back hard with the butt of his weapon and insulted me with extremely obscene language, saying, 'You are a whore, a bitch, a Hamas elite.' Another soldier said, 'Sit down, whore, sit down, bitch.' They pulled off my head covering while I was crying and begging them to cover my hair, laughing and refusing to put it back on me." All of this and more is what the Israeli Foreign Ministry is again calling one of the most hideous and distorted lies ever published against the state of Israel in the modern press. You might think, given those statements, that actors within the Israeli government aren't aware of the horrors that are occurring, but this isn't even the first time all of this has been reported. In fact, in 2024 in State Taman, a functional concentration camp where many of these testimonies come from, Israeli soldiers were recorded on CCTV footage assaulting a Palestinian in the open. Those soldiers lined up their prison riot shields in an attempt to obstruct the view of this camera as they went through the acts they were going through. And when that news dropped, when those soldiers began to be held accountable in some small way, Israelis across the colony began to protest and even riot, not because of what they had done, but because they were being held accountable for it. Now, it's important to note as we sort of digest that information that this is not something without historic parallels. Violence up to and including sexual violence by colonial or imperialist actors within the confines of their prison and detention facilities is something that's been widespread across the world for decades, if not centuries. One might remember the horrific videos and testimonies that came out of the abuses being done by US soldiers in Abu Ghraib, for example, or the horrific testimony of Irish prisoners within British colonial H blocks during the Troubles. Truthfully, there are countless examples, so many that I don't even think you could include them all in one video. But all of this needs to be stated because it is a horrific reality that Palestinians are facing every single day from within the confines of these colonial institutions. No human being deserves to face the kind of violence that Palestinians are facing at the hands of their Israeli captors, and this violence is not happening in isolated instances, but rather is a systematic practice. And the Israeli government is trying desperately to shut down reporting surrounding this because they understand just how egregious all of this is. They know that what they're doing is wrong, and what they're trying to do is escape accountability now that news of those injustices is erupting across the world. It's critical then that all of us understand what is going on and that we talk about it, that we tell people about the horrors that Palestinians are facing from within these institutions. It's horrible to hear about, it's horrible to even speak of, but it's even more horrible for Palestinians who have to physically experience it in their day-to-day. These aren't hideous and distorted lies. This is the reality that Palestinians have been facing for decades. Something worth thinking about, I think. But yeah, as always, free Palestine, Assalamu alaikum. Until next time.